Hi, I'm Corinne Maury, and I'm doing my best to have conversations with smart people. So today, I'm going to introduce you to Suzanne Anton because her perspective is something that I think is important for us to think about while we're exploring all of our social issues that are going on in our province right now. Suzanne Anton was elected as an MLA in 2013. She moved into the position of Minister of Justice and Attorney General. And in this role, you are responsible for justice issues that were in the BC government. And it was your job to ensure that the government functioned according to the law. Can you explain to us in layman's terms what that means? What was your specific job? And then can you give us just a general overview of what the purpose and the function of the law is in relation to the government?
Okay, Corinne, hello and thank you and welcome to all of your viewers and listeners. Pleasure to be with you today. So I was Attorney General for 4 years, 2013 to 2017, under the premiership of Premier Christy Clark. So I was a key member of her cabinet as Attorney General. As Attorney General, your foundational role is to ensure that the government of British Columbia conducts its affairs in a legal manner. Now, you can't oversee every little decision that's made, but you certainly do oversee the major decisions that are made, major things that are signed, major agreements that are signed, for example. And if things come to your attention that don't seem right, it is your job to do something about them. It is also your job to defend the law to the cabinet members around you. Sometimes people say, well, can't we do this or can't we do that? And if in fact you can't, then you must say to them, no, you cannot. And sometimes there can be pressure on you, but it's your job to just stand up for what the law is. Many people remember the story of Jody Wilson-Raybould, who was Attorney General in the Liberal government, and there was a lot of pressure on her, and she finally did what people have to do, what an Attorney General has to do if things are being done that they do not approve of. You resign. We haven't had that happen in British Columbia for a long time. In fact, I'm not even sure, probably 20 years ago or more. And I used to know the circumstances, but I'm sorry, I've forgotten them. But if the premier does something that you view as being illegal and you cannot talk the premier out of it, you resign. You can tell that did not happen while I was Attorney General, because I was there until we unfortunately in 2017 lost the election. So the kinds of things that I was in charge of, some of the big files I had so that's the foundational role of the Attorney General. At the same time, you've got all kinds of things that you have to think about. You have to think about the justice system, the courts. You have to appoint judges to the provincial court. You pay attention to the Law Society and what the Law Society is doing. We had quite a big project when I was there, which I'm very proud of, actually, which is the Civil Resolution Tribunal. Corinne, anyone you know who's had a small claim, they now go to an online tribunal, and those more minor amounts are dealt with quite quickly through the Civil Resolution Tribunal. So a minor argument with a neighbor over a tree, or somebody broke something on your property, or somebody owes you some money under a contract, those can go to a Civil Resolution Tribunal. So that was quite a big change in the law. It actually made the minor disputes much easier to get a remedy for. You also have to pay attention to how the judicial system is functioning. Not so much appointing the Superior Court judges, because those are federal appointments. However, running the courthouses, etc., is the responsibility of the Attorney General. So those are the main things I did in that role as Attorney General. The other file, which may interest some of your viewers, is that prior to me being elected, many people remember the terrible circumstances of the missing and murdered Indigenous women. And they may remember that a previous Attorney General, Wally Opal, had done a review and published quite a number of recommendations. So that too was part of my job, was implementing the recommendations from that commission. So that was a very interesting piece of work, of course, that led me to work very closely with First Nations women in British Columbia. Very interesting. I got a lot of insights and a lot of information. And one other thing that I'll just mention one other of our main files. People will remember with Premier Christy Clark, we had three things to do: balance the budget, grow the economy, and get LNG underway. And in terms of the LNG, one of the big roles was to work very closely with the First Nations all along the pipeline route and get agreements signed. And by the way, it was John Rustad who, as then the Minister of Aboriginal Relations, worked on so many of those agreements. So that's why the pipeline is flowing now, the natural gas pipeline. And as of next year, it will start shipping liquefied natural gas out of the Kitimat harbor. And so I'm very proud of that. That was the determination of our premier and our entire cabinet at the time. So those were the roles I played. COVID came later. And I think the controversy and why you've brought me here today is to ask me about some of that response. When in 2019, at the end of 2019, early 2020, people will remember that the COVID rules started being made. Increasingly complex rules came out of the public health officer, resulting in the following year, 2021, there were vaccines, and then there were the vaccine mandates. So we can get into that, but I'll just leave it there for the moment, and then you ask me what you would like to ask me. But I was not, the Attorney General had a role throughout that, and the Attorney General was David Eby and currently Nikki Sharma, and their role, again, is to make sure that things that the government does are done lawfully.
Okay, so as you mentioned, there were some shifts that happened during the pandemic era. And so, now we're 3 years later from the decisions that were made. And to me, the whole purpose of the law is fundamentally to protect the rights of citizens. And so we were actually seeing a violation of that in terms of, we should have protections for my body, my choice. We should have the ability to freely move. These things were severely restricted by government. And as a result, what I saw was the laws were still in place, but what we saw was there was a lack of enforcement of those laws to actually safeguard citizens. So now this sort of raises concerns about the state of our BC government and the decisions that are made currently now that are coming through the judicial system. And it seems that there are places where the law doesn't seem to be working. And I think it's important that we examine those events. We evaluate whether the legal frameworks and the processes were actually enacted appropriately. And if the purpose of the law is to ensure citizens' rights, in your opinion, right now, how are we faring?
Yeah, so there's a lot in that question, Corinne. Let me start with the initial rules that came out. So these would have been in 2020. And I used to watch them as they came. I have a record of quite a few of them, actually, and quite a few of the press conferences that were given, because they never sat right with me. I don't want to say this is what I would have done as an attorney general. I don't want to try and second guess that, because it would be, I freely acknowledge it would have been a very difficult position because of the sheer volume of public pressure to do something. So initially the rules were annoying, but not all that bad. I will say that in May of 2020, I tweeted skepticism. That reminds me, it's almost the 4-year anniversary of that tweet. I must recognize it. And boy, oh boy, was the public mad at me. And that was skepticism over having to sign in a restaurant. The restaurant relationship, if a customer walking into a restaurant, it's got to be one of the oldest on the planet, the oldest commercial relationships there is, people buying food from someone who cooks it. And to have to sign in, and I tweeted at the time that this seemed like the beginning of the reduction of our rights. And you know what? I was absolutely right. it just the things around us got more and more constrained over the next 2 years. And it wasn't only until about 2 years later in 2022 that some of those rules had been lifted before, but the bulk of them didn't come off until 2022. And as you know, there are still some remaining. And we'll get to that, to the vaccine mandates. So the rules were really quite absurd. They went on about who could sign who in, how far apart the restaurant tables had to be, how many people could sit in the church. I found that the rules against freedom of religion were highly offensive. I think that's a pretty straightforward equation, that we have freedom of religion of all times, that you need the help and the comfort of your community and your faith. There could be no greater need than during that time. And yet the churches did not fight back. And Corinne, this is a theme that I have. People did not argue or fight back enough, in my view. The churches should have fought back. The media should have been skeptical. Citizens should have been skeptical. Some were, of course, but there was never enough volume of skepticism to really change the mind of the authorities. So you could go to a gym, but you couldn't go to a church. All these complicated rules. And if you look back now, they're almost laughable because they're so complicated that nobody could possibly have kept track of them all. They went on for paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs. What we never saw, Corinne, was the science behind them. And of course, it turns out now that there wasn't any. There was never any science for masking. I was always extremely skeptical of masking. I hate wearing a mask. I can't breathe, I can't see, and I can't hear for some reason. I don't know why. There was no science. There was not even any science between, the 6 feet between people. There was never any science for closing schools. I will say, to BC's credit, our schools were not closed as long as other jurisdictions. And I will give BC credit for that. All those other multitudes of rules that people just happily followed. We never saw the science. We really never saw the justification for them. And I think that is where an attorney general might have been much more demanding. You have to show me the evidence. And I think that's where the courts are failing right now. We can come back to this in a minute if you like, but there's no evidence. There's no real evidence being shown for any of the things that happened during 2020.
What is your opinion about the latest decision that came down this week that Justice Cavall, I believe, cited on behalf that the decisions that came from Bonnie Henry were legitimate and enforceable? What is your perspective on that?
So I'll move from 2020 into 2021, where we started to have the vaccines. I think they came in at the end of 2020. And during early 2021, there was a tremendous amount of pressure on people to get the vaccine. You will remember every public figure was saying, get your vaccine. Every pundit on television was urging people to get their vaccines. Doctors were telling people, you must have your vaccine. The vaccinated started getting demonized. You'll remember the Prime Minister in his election campaign saying that unvaccinated people were not to be tolerated. It was just an incredibly divisive and terrible time in our country. I was absolutely horrified by that, by the dividing of people into the clean and the unclean, that we could suddenly do that to our own citizens in this country. And again, people didn't stand up to it particularly well. And then when we came to mandates, I don't think people stood up to them particularly well, to the vaccine mandates, that you couldn't do this and you couldn't do that. I just have to talk for a second about the BC orders at Christmas time of 2021. Well, if you've got 6 people and 1 vaccinated, you can't have the unvaccinated and the vaccinated. And then they went on and on and on, and everyone was more complicated and more ridiculous than the last. Nobody could possibly have followed them. I doubt if very many people obeyed them. I hope they didn't. But these elaborate constructs of who could be in the room at Christmas time. And you remember then they shut down New Year's, and I don't know. I wonder what would have happened if all the restaurants and all the media had just said, no, sorry, we're just going to go ahead with our New Year's, because if you actually have enough people pushing back, then government can't do it. They can only govern at the end of the day with the consent of people. And Corinne,
I'll jump in here because I certainly found it interesting that the first sector that was, I'm going to use the word target because it was a target, was the healthcare professionals. And we're one of the few sectors that actually has to conduct ourselves by ethical standards. And both the Medicare Act and our ethical standards say that we have to protect the individual's right to their autonomy and their decision making. So by going after professionals who actually operate by ethical standards was, to me, the first arrow that was shot into our ability to be able to function as a life force. Because then you demonized the people who were actually operating by integrity and ethics and made them the enemy.
So that was not the first arrow, though. The first arrow was making people sign into a restaurant, then making people wear masks, then not allowing people in to visit their old folks in the long-term care homes. That one, to me, Corinne, except possibly for the people being fired, I don't know which was worse. We were very fortunate to have my super senior father-in-law live with us throughout COVID. And we all got COVID at one point, including him, and he recovered. But thank goodness he was here and we didn't care. There were branches of my family that were vaccinated. There were branches that weren't. And am I going to tell him he can't kiss his great-grandchildren when he's 98 and 99? Of course not. Of course not. Our house was always open for him. And the thought of him being locked in a room, he would have died at the beginning of COVID. I think a lot of seniors did die at the beginning of COVID all by themselves. I think that was just the height of cruelty. And again, people
so then how do you feel, like, did it surprise you that the government, who is actually, their function is to support residents in this province, did it surprise you that the government was so intent on punishing and demoralizing anyone that would dare to question their decisions?
Well, so I can point the blame in many directions, Corinne, and I have kind of an all-encompassing pointing set of pointed fingers here, including at the public, that we didn't, I protested, but did I protest loudly enough? The members of the public did not push back. The media dropped any semblance of skepticism. They still don't have any skepticism. I'm horrified by the role of the media. The churches, as I've mentioned, didn't protest. The people who ran the long-term care homes, why didn't they say, we just have done a judgment call and we just don't think it's worth it to make these poor old people sit all alone, dying without their grandchildren around them to kiss them goodbye? I just think that's so horrible. So all of these people that did not push back. So when it came that the arrow was pointing directly at the healthcare workers didn't push back. And I know I've said before that the Quebec nurses pushed back, and that was the end of it. The Quebec nurses said, no, thank you, and that was the end of it. So I sometimes comment specifically about the nurses, Corinne, but I actually think it's a bit unfair of me to signal out the nurses, because everybody should have pushed back. By the time the arrow was pointed at you and your profession, we were already locked into that philosophy that everything that the government did was right.
Well, I'm going to add in another little element here, because I don't think the public is really aware of all of the dynamics that comes into play with nurses. And the fact is, we are all forced into being union members. And once you become a union member, you legally give representation of any employment issues to the union. They're the ones that determine how they're going to step in to protect you in your job. And as an individual, I have no ability under the law to protect myself. It is up to the union to do so. And in our case, the union went silent. And now we see 2-3 years later, the union is accepting massive payouts from the BC NDP government. Over the course of 3 years, that union will be receiving $850 million from the government, which is when a union's job is to hold a government accountable. How is that possible if they're taking more money from the entity that they're to hold to account than they are from their own members? So there is a lot of things under the surface that have been going on that have ensured that we as nurses who were impacted and other healthcare professionals, we are not able to access the protection of the law because the union is withholding it from us.
Yeah. So the mandates came in, as you know, in the fall of 2021. Mm-hmm. And at that time, there were mandates all over the place for different professions. Most of them got lifted in 2022. However, for some reason, we can get into this, the healthcare workers mandate continued. Now, unfortunately, again, as I say, if all of the doctors and all of the nurses and all of everybody else had said no, that would have been the end of it. But it's interesting, actually, because I used to be a huge supporter of the public health system, but it's called into question my support of the public health system. I think fundamentally it's good that we have a public health system, but there was nothing to rival it. There was no other group that wasn't beholden to government because at the end of the day, you're an employee of a government entity. And there was no one who wasn't in that position who had the ability to stand up and, to say, no, we're not going to take these orders. My body, myself, so you were stuck with that position. And then, of course, you had the double problem of your union not backing you. The 850 million you're talking about, I can't comment on that, Corinne. I know you've pointed it out to me before, as have others. I don't, unfortunately, understand enough of the union environment and the rules around unions to really have a comment on that. Where I can comment, though, is that people need to have a remedy. They need to be able to get into court. I was talking earlier about the Civil Resolution Tribunal, where somebody cuts your tree down by mistake and you want $5,000 for the tree. That's the Civil Resolution Tribunal. That's the example at the far end of the easy way to get into court, because you can get a hearing on that quickly. Your case, the case of the healthcare workers, we have just had a judicial review. I'll go into that in a sec, which lost. And in your case, the nurses, you've never even been able to have your grievance heard. And to me, it's fundamental that citizens should be able to question government decisions in a tribunal of some kind. The labor code is written so that the unions have a tribunal that they can take their issues to. And for others, the tribunal is the court itself. And Corinne, I just think that the nurses union, the nurses who have stepped, who've been fired now, who are no longer working because of this, you will have to ask a practicing lawyer. I'm not a practicing lawyer, but what I will comment on, though, is it is extraordinarily unfair that you do not have a tribunal that you can ask to look at your case.
So in my journey through the last couple of years, I have started to explore the concept of democracy, which is the ability of the people themselves to be able to participate in the decisions that affect them. I am seeing instead this widening divide of the government removing the ability of the public to engage in decisions. And I'll use the Housing Development Act as an example, where now provincial government will override local government in development policies and bylaws. And in the process, they have removed, or they've actually made it illegal for public hearings. This is just one spot I see in many where the ability for the public to engage in decisions is being systematically removed. If the judicial system, if the courts are not in a place that they can hold the government to account, and the government continues to make decisions that erode the whole concept and the function of a democratic society, what do you anticipate our society will look like in a few years?
Well, sometimes the easiest place of all to make a change is at the ballot box. And these kinds of decisions can easily be changed by a change of government, that kind of decision. The same with the firing, the public health orders, that could be changed with a change of government. Just to go back to the courts, though, for a minute, the process for the case that was just heard was the healthcare professionals who were non-unionized. So there were doctors in that lawsuit. There were technical people. You could probably tell more clearly than I can who all the people were. But I think if you were a lab technician, but not unionized, or if you were, there were some roles that were not in the union, and they were the ones who brought the application forward to the court in that judicial review. Do you want to just to tell who else was in that case? I know it was the doctors because
There
I
was,
talked to the
yeah,
doctors.
physicians, nurse practitioners. There was also healthcare workers that worked in remote locations, so they had absolutely no patient contact at all.
But they must not have been unionized, that group.
That's right, non-unionized.
Yeah, they were all non-union. So the remedy for an action by a bureaucrat, which is what this was, is the order of the public health officer. The remedy for that is a judicial review. You can take it to court and say, here, judge, this public official did more than she was entitled to do. Like all of these cases, they depend on it is a judgment call for the judge. And I think if the judge had had a modicum of skepticism, it would have been a better decision. But as it is, there was no skepticism. There was no evidence called. It was simply reading the things that Dr. Henry had read and said, yeah, it all looks fine to me. And the case was dismissed, except for the remote workers. He carved out one little piece for I doubt if there's very many of them, but the few people who were working remotely, I don't see how any sensible person could possibly imagine that an entirely remote worker should be subject to a mandate. So he did say that. But all of the rest of them, the mandates are just fine, even though the weight of decisions, particularly, by the way, in the arbitration world, the weight of decisions right now says that an unvaccinated worker is no difference in threat to a patient than a vaccinated worker. They're indistinguishable in terms of their risk. Even though that's coming out of all the cases that you see out of Ontario, it came out of the Purelator Courier decision here from, I think it was Canada Labour Board, as a matter of fact, but it was done here in British Columbia. Those cases have recognized that what I just said, which is that the unvaccinated worker is no risk, no more than a vaccinated worker. However, British Columbia, alone in the world, practically has decided that there is a greater risk. So how that could be seen as a reasonable decision is completely beyond me, Corinne. Just doesn't make any sense.
So you mentioned that, one method that the public has when it comes time to trying to make sure that our democratic process is functional is to show up at the ballot box and vote. What happens when there's a lot of censorship from the media as to the messaging that comes across, when the public is not actually able to access accurate information about the candidates or the parties themselves, or even understanding that the political parties themselves could be compromised? What really do you think we need to do to rebuild this political process so that it's not being, what I see is that the government has made allegiance with what I'm going to call external sources rather than being loyal to the allegiance of BC residents. And that's been taking place with just how much taxation is being incurred, how much regulation is being imposed, the amount of control that the government is wanting to impose on just your middle class average person. And so I just see this shift of allegiance that it's now no longer the people that are the priority. There are other things going on that are becoming that I think the public generally knows. I just know something's wrong. I don't know what it is, but I just know something's wrong.
Yeah. Again, that's at the ballot box. And that's why we are getting around the world what they call sort of disdainfully, the government class calls disdainfully populist governments. Populist government just means that people think that that's the right thing to do. And so we are getting governments around the world that are recognizing that. And as a matter of fact, I think that poor fellow in Slovakia who was just shot, I think he could probably be described in that way. He was skeptical about a lot of this stuff that's going on. He was shot. Who knows why? That sounds like I've got a conspiracy theory going there, but I don't want to make any kind of comments like that. I haven't the faintest idea, but it is. But he was one of the governments around the world who is described in that way. Donald Trump, who may get elected, is described as a populist. You know, even Britain leaving, even Brexit was just described as a populist move. I'll just make a little personal comment about myself here. I was horrified when Brexit happened. I thought, oh my gosh, how dreadful. But then the more I learned about it, and the more we actually traveled to the UK at that time and traveled around and talked to a lot of people. Of course, you're traveling, you talk to people. I came away from there thinking, no wonder they got rid of Europe. Who in a sovereign country wants someone else telling you what to do? And I think that's what you're talking about, Corinne. You're worried that, or one worry is, I don't mean you specifically, but there is a worry that the government is obeying a higher command. I don't know if I would say that about our BC government. They just seem to think differently than you do, and probably than I do on these matters. Is that true federally? Are they too much under the influence of what you call the global sort of interest in various things? Perhaps, but I'd rather keep this discussion local. And I think, you know, there is shaping up to be a pretty clear choice in the next provincial election, which is to agree that the rulemaking of the current NDP government is the right thing to do, or to go to maybe a more liberty. I don't know what the right expression is, but you know, I think what the Conservatives, for example, and also the BC United to some degree are offering is actually something quite different. And so that is a choice. And those two parties, by the way, have both said we are going to hire back the fired healthcare workers. Such
So,
remains of Corinne, if you all haven't gone off into the sunset and found better things to do. Which I don't know how many there will be left after this length of time. It'll be 3 years by then.
yes. And, you know, I'm to the place where now I am looking at, we need to focus on who the individual candidates are in our riding. Just because you go with a specific party does not mean that you are actually going to be taken care of in your own community. And I think we need to do a little better job of making sure that our candidates have some kind of understanding about financial budgets, that understand the law, that understand all of the pressures that are occurring with delivery of service to the public. And I know in my case, my skill level, I think, is quite high, but I'm choosing to not go onto a party because the moment that you are under a party, your allegiance is to the party. It is not to your people. So right off the bat, by having party representation, we don't actually have the freedom to represent our people if it's in conflict with what our party is saying.
Yeah,
but these are just parts that every community needs to take responsibility for itself and to look at who is offering their services and then choose wisely. Because really, when it comes down to it, whoever you elect as your representation, you're giving your PIN number of your bank account to them. So you should absolutely know how they spend money and what they put their resources into. Okay, so I'm going to just... we've got 5 minutes left. What is the one thought that you would like to leave with the public?
Our rights, as we have seen over the last 3 years, are easily diminished. And it is up to every single one of us to fight for them and to pay attention, even if there's censorship, even if people around you are making decisions that you don't like, even if your friends get mad at you, which I think, you know, lots of people, you know, families were divided, people got mad. It is up to every single person and every single entity, the churches, the unions, the professional associations, the people in long-term care homes and their families. It is up to everyone to stand up for their rights. If people stand up for their rights, we keep them. If you give government your blessing to, oh, don't worry about my rights, they're secondary to this terribly important virus that's going around, then you lose them. And I think that, Corinne, is the most important thing of all. I'm glad you're running. And I will say just comment on one thing that you just said, though. You are always responsible for your own people, because if you don't help your own people, you will not get reelected. So there is that. It's a dual responsibility. The ballot box is extraordinarily important. Every citizen's job is to pay attention to who's running and vote for the person who represents your interests the best. And every person who runs is doing a service to their community. And by the way, if anyone around you ever hears the word failed candidate, I reject that completely. Every candidate is a good candidate. Some of them happen to prevail in an election, but every single person who steps up is performing an important role. And I really applaud you and others around you who are stepping up in the next election.
Thank you, Suzanne. It is always really important that the public be able to hear insider perspective, because it's arenas that most of us don't get to access, and your input is valuable, and I really appreciate you being willing to speak with us today. So I'm sure we'll have more conversations later, but thank you.
A pleasure. Thank you, Corinne.